Welcome back to the end of the first historical period of Daniel and his record of the Neo-Babylonian and early Medo-Persian empires. Basically, carrying the story forward throughout the life of Daniel's ministry in Babylon. And then the second half of the book of Daniel fits back in the prophetic work of Daniel and what God revealed through him during the period that we've already covered. So the second half of the book of Daniel does not carry the story forward in terms of chronology. It only brings back in, it's organized logically, which makes really good sense if Daniel wrote the book, which it appears that he did. That he would record the events and then he would record the prophecies that God gave him throughout this time period. So it fits really well. So this is where we're going to take our break. Pastor Culver had given me, a few weeks ago, a heads up, said, hey, listen, if you need an extra week, September 8th, you can have it. It's all right. So we'll see. My wife, I know where her money is if she were a betting woman, that whether or not I'm going to finish today. But we'll see how that goes. If we can finish today, we're done. If not, we'll take one more week to wrap it up. And then we'll take a break through the fall, and when the winter quarter comes again, then I'll pick back up. So that's kind of the plan at this point. All right. Daniel chapter 6. We know the account fairly well for those of us who grew up in a believing church. We know the account fairly well. Let's go ahead and read it again with fresh eyes if you haven't this week already. Let's go back and read it again with fresh eyes. I'm reading, as you know, from New American Standard Bible, so it'll be slightly different from what you're reading if you have the ESV or King James. But maybe that'll help you kind of pay attention to as we go through. It seemed good. Oh, let me back up just for a second. Let's do verses 30 and 31, which are the transition, both historically and literarily, from between the chapters, right? That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they should be in charge of the whole kingdom. I'm hopelessly pausing. I'll try not to do this throughout the whole thing. But I will note that, do you recall that at the beginning of the book, the discussion about how Nebuchadnezzar organized the Neo-Babylonian Empire and its administrative structure was kind of important in how things were done? Here we're going to see that this is going to be important again because it's going to speak to the role Daniel's going to have, called out of retirement by Belshazzar for that last night before the Neo-Babylonian Empire falls. And now under the Median king Darius, probably, maybe we'll talk about who he is, the Medo-Persian ruler from Babylon, which is not the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire anymore, right? But is not, never has been. So he's going to take over, and his reorganization is going to be important in the role of Daniel taking over. So we see that change happening there. So it seemed good to Darius to, and by the way, you can pronounce his name Darius as whatever is comfortable to you. It's just what comes out to me at the moment. It seemed good to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they should be in charge of the whole kingdom. And over them three commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began to distinguish himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom, another modification in the reorganization. Then the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to the government and affairs, but they could not find any ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground of accusation against Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the high officials, and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. These men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached this and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king answered and said, The statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who was one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you have signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then, as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute, which the king establishes, may be changed. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing might be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose at dawn, at the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. And when he had come near to the den, to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. And the king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him. And toward you also, O king, I have committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered and crushed all their bones. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land, May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. Does anything sound like an echo here? Are you hearing echoes of the past? And he delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel also from the power of the lions. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And basically, that's the end of the record with regard to Daniel's life. That's the conclusion of the book with regard to the life of Daniel, historically speaking. All right. Forgive my halting speech. Sometimes I struggle to read aloud. Yahweh's rule. We see again a conclusion, a determination by a Gentile king that ultimately the God of Israel, the God of Daniel, the God of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, this God is not like the other gods. Not always the clearest theology, right? As if there were other gods, right? But this God is still unique. And this God, key idea, this God rules. So whatever we know about Gentile rule, or the world's kingdoms, the thing that is reiterated over and over and over again in the book of Daniel is that no matter what it looks like for God's people's God rules. And in this case, law is the central focus. So we've been kind of focusing on different elements of worldly rule all the way through. And here we get to, what about law? What about law even when it is, from an ancient perspective, a kind of deterioration of power? Here we see something that would never have been true for Nebuchadnezzar or one of the Babylonian kings. Here we see a king who was bound by the law. Not so for Nebuchadnezzar. If Nebuchadnezzar had felt like Darius felt about Daniel and realized what was going on when his servants came to him or his advisors came to him and said, oh, well, this guy keeps praying, there would have been short shrift about that. Well, this doesn't apply to Daniel, and you're in deep trouble for accusing him. That would have been the end of it, if he had felt like Darius did. Not so for Darius. He was stuck. And at the transition of the kingdoms, we often think, I think it's natural to think that when a kingdom conquers another kingdom, that it's all simple from there, right? We've just proven we can defeat you. We've got you. We can do whatever we want because we just won. The truth is that transitions from kingdom to kingdom are fraught with complication and tenuous question about whether or not the conquered people are really going to submit to the new rule. And so for Darius, what we find here is a really common theme in world history, which is when a kingdom conquers, they've got to get the hearts and the minds of the people at least subdued, if not cooperative. So it seems that, again, sort of like Babylon did, more so with Medo-Persia, because the Persian policy we talked about a little bit before, but it seems like a lot of these rulers ruling the Babylonian section now of the Medo-Persian Empire, that a lot of these are Babylonians, they're Chaldeans. It's a lot of the same old administration brought in. Not all. Belshazzar was killed, right? You don't want rival dynasties if you're a new kingdom. But a lot of these are the same people. So it's likely that these are not Medo-Persian people accusing Daniel. These are sort of the same old jealous set accusing Daniel. These, not necessarily the same people, but the same set. It's the former Babylonian leadership structure that are doing this. And they understand the new kingdom arrangement, that in this new kingdom, there's been an adjustment in the way authority works. And the law of the Medes and Persians, once it is certified by the king, is set, and even the king is bound to it, unlike previous authority. And so they're going to use that to their advantage. But they're also kind of putting Darius on the spot to have to follow through consistently in order to get buy-in from the people that have just been conquered. So that's context. Now, if you take notes, I would suggest that you draw a small shield. That's something most of us can do, whatever you think of as a shield, and write faith on it. at the beginning of your notes, right? That's what I would encourage you to do. Because I would say consider Ephesians 6, verses 10 through 16 in an Old Testament context when we study this book. Because what we're going to find is that the emphasis of the chapter especially, and we have seen in the book over and over again, is that the role of faith is central to God's work through His people. We trust Him, we follow His word. We trust Him, He chooses to intervene. We trust Him, He glorifies His name. Faith is a mechanism whereby God accomplishes His will in the lives of people, though He doesn't need it, and He can, frankly, okay, I'm not sure I'm going to use the word force, would probably not be the right word, but He can sure extract expressions of faith when He wants to. Think Nebuchadnezzar, right? 7 years eat grass, you will make a statement of faith, right? He can certainly extract it when He wants to, but God works through this mechanism. So I think of Ephesians 6 and the armor of God. Be strong in the Lord, the strength of His might. Put on the full armor of God that you may be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. We see a lot of scheming happening in Daniel chapter 6. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's ultimately not these satraps and rulers that are the real problem for Daniel, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of the darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. And we're going to find in chapter 7 through 12 that that's exactly what is going on here. That everything that Daniel has recounted from a human perspective, even though miraculous things are happening in chapters 1 through 6, what we're going to find is there's a whole realm going on at the same time above and beyond in the spiritual level, on the spiritual level. And there are forces of wickedness battling forces of righteousness in the spiritual realm, and that is bound up not only in the broad historic plan of God's plan with Israel, but I think also bound up in what's going on with Daniel and his three friends and other Jewish people in Babylon. Therefore, what do we do? Take up the full armor of God, verse 13, that you may be able to resist in the evil day. Well, Daniel was in retirement. He wasn't planning for more evil to come upon him. He thought he'd probably made it through the tough parts, right? But another evil day came. And having done everything in preparation, in other words, you will be able to stand firm. You can't wait till you get there. Stand firm, therefore, having girded your loins with truth. Daniel certainly did that. Having put on the breastplate of righteousness. Daniel certainly displayed that. And having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Now, in this case, New Testament, we're talking specifically about the gospel that gives peace between man. But notice both in Nebuchadnezzar's case and here again in Darius's case, what do they proclaim at the end of their experience with Daniel and his God to the whole world? May your peace abound. So even in the Old Testament, a relationship or a knowledge of God brings true peace. This is the peace becomes the desire. I don't think that's just a boilerplate stamp like sincerely at the end of a letter. Which I hope is not boilerplate for you either. I hope when you write things, it's sincere. But that's the gospel of peace was apparently involved, even though it's not the gospel fully developed as the New Testament gives us. In addition to all, taking up the shield of faith, with which you will be able to extinguish all the flaming missiles of the evil one. And that's what Daniel is doing in chapter 6. In what we've read. So I would put your shield, I would write faith, and I would jot down below the shield how you think faith is a shield against the attacks of our adversaries. Right? I just start reading, in what way? Why is faith a shield against the attacks of our adversaries? Why is that true? Right? Some of it's obvious, but think about that. What is it that makes that work? It's not just a theological truth, it's a functional reality, it's practical reality. And then, one of the things that we should note as we go through Daniel chapter 6 is how faith may be used in defense against the attacks of our enemies. Right? 2 Timothy 3:12 says that all those who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. I would argue that all those who desire to live godly in Yahweh of Israel, even in exile, we're going to suffer persecution. Since the chapter is very familiar, I'm going to cover it from two angles rather than the kind of verse-by-verse understanding. That's why I read it to begin with. I want to look at it as, let's understand the facts of what's going on in the chapter, and then let's learn what I think the narrative is teaching us, largely, from the chapter. Though, of course, there's always more in God's Word than I see or we can get in one sitting. But the first is interpretation. Understand. Let's interpret the chapter. Let's understand what it says. And then the second is application. What can we learn from it? So that's where we're going to go with, oh, I thought I'd already done that. It didn't move because I pushed on my screen. All right, so that's what I'd said. Here we go. Let's start with, who is Darius the Mede? We keep getting introduced to people with no explanation, right? By the way, this is a testimony of the historicity of book. Books that go, ancient documents that go out of their way to explain the historical circumstances give clues that they are written at a time period and to a people who don't get the historical circumstances. The fact that we keep being introduced to characters without explanation is a testimony to the time period in which it was written. Nobody had to explain who Darius the Mede was. Everybody in Chaldea knew who Darius the Mede was. The kingdom had just shifted. Proclamations had been sent. This is a historical book written at the time period where you don't have to explain who he is. If it had been written in the 2nd century, like the critics say it was, nobody would have written a book in the 2nd century purporting to be original and not explained who Darius the Mede was. They would have instinctively known that their readers don't know who that is, and they would have included some summary explanation, right? But it does leave us a little bit perplexed because Darius is not so well attested a character in non-biblical literature as some of the other individuals that we have met. So it seemed good to Darius the Mede. To Darius, right? This is Darius the Mede receives the kingdom about the age of 62. Well, notice the detail also about the age of 62, right? This is, it reads like the author of this text or the writer of this text has a really familiar knowledge with this individual. Well, he's not been clearly identified in the documentary or archaeological record. So the short answer to who was Darius the Mede is he's exactly who the Bible says he was. He is Darius the Mede, and he ruled from Babylon at the beginning of the Medo-Persian period, right? Beyond that, we probably should be really cautious. So I'm going to throw out some cautious recommendations that scholars, biblically minded scholars, and also those who aren't terribly believing of the word have thrown out, and I'll give you some just give you an idea of who this may have been. So one of the most common things is it's just a name in the Aramaic Babylonian context. It's just another name for Cyrus. So Cyrus rules as Cyrus the Persian and Darius the Mede. And that's possible. It's not uncommon for rulers to do that. Even in the more modern period following the ancient trend, like you can have, he's James the First of Scotland and James the Fifth of England, or whatever, the verse I think is. James the First of England, James the Fifth of Scotland. It's the same guy, all right? But depends on what realm you're connecting him to, all right? So that is possible. He may simply be Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great lived from about 590 to about 529 BC. This is near the end of his life that he transitions and wins the kingdom. There are some who translate it this way. So, for example, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was made when, about 200 years before Christ, so many Jews had dispersed around the Greek and then soon to be Roman Empire that the Hellenization process. Culturally, the world was becoming more Greek, the civilized world, and they had learned Greek. They were forgetting Hebrew. The Jewish leadership was concerned about this, and so they had the Bible translated into Greek, right? Comes from a name 70, based on a tradition that 70 scholars met together and put it together, whatever. Yes?
If it is Cyrus, if those dates are right, and this is either the last year of his life, because it says 62 here, and you only have 61 years on the screen.
Oh, really? Okay. That's interesting. Thank you very much. I knew that and had forgotten when I put it on the screen. Thank you. Yes, so I'm going to argue it's not, by the way. I'm going to argue it's not Cyrus, but it is a possibility, okay? So if it's Cyrus, then you would have to render chapter 6, verse 28, Darius even the reign of Cyrus, right? So you go to 628, the end. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius, New American Standard reads Darius, and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Okay? But it would be Darius even the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
I mean, obviously Cyrus was reigning, right? So that's not a question, but
yes.
From a textual standpoint, is there justification for putting his name there?
The reason, so his name is there in all texts. So Cyrus and Darius are both there in verse 28 in all texts. The question is the conjunction. Really? Okay, well that's because King James is just using a set of texts that didn't include him, but he's there in the majority of the text. I think it's probably there. Yeah. I didn't look at the textual problem, so I'm guessing about that, James. I'm guessing at that. So in verse 28, 628. Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, no. He's not in chapter 5. He's in chapter 6. Wow, I did not remember that textual issue, so I was worried about that. It's like, wow, why didn't I catch that? Sorry about that. Okay, well, that's good. That's good. I feel better. I hate standing at the front and seeing things I didn't catch. Almost had 2 of them there, and I was about to just call it a good day and drink my coffee and let you guys handle the rest. That's all right. So the Septuagint, and also in the early Christian era, in the era of the early Middle Ages, Theodotion, that translation also both render it kind of in this way. Theodotion renders chapter 11, verse 1, the first year of Cyrus. So if you turn to chapter 11, verse 1, and in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. Okay? But Theodotion's translation in the early Middle Ages renders that in the first year of Cyrus. He's trying to correct what he thinks is a scribal error. I think that's unnecessary. I don't think Cyrus is it. It's difficult to know exactly what the timing is in terms of Cyrus's birth. This circa 590 is problematic, actually, because Cyrus clearly lived beyond this particular date, and this is closer to 539. So he's going to live for a while after this. It's like 10 years. So the 61-62 thing is problematic because of the C590. And so that's kind of a secular chronology conflict with scriptural conflict, okay? So the second option is that he may be, this gets into some fun names, he may be Ugbaru of the Nabonidus Chronicle. We mentioned the Nabonidus Chronicle briefly before. It's an ancient record that gives us a good chronological piece that lines up actually with what Scripture says, and so it reinforced things that they used to question. Scholars used to question whether the Bible from the late 19th century rational period, and then the Nabonidus Chronicle kind of said, well, actually it lines up pretty well in terms of dating. So Ugbaru of the Nabonidus Chronicle, this is a tablet dating to the Seleucid or Greek period between the 4th and the 1st century BC, but it's based on an original text dating to the late 6th century BC. We know that based on what it was written, but we don't have the original 6th century BC version. So again, it's a testimony, though, to the ancientness of Daniel. And according to this view, Ugabaru would also be a derivative name of the same person who is called Gubaru or Gobrias, found elsewhere in Medo-Persian inscriptions. It's probably the same person, just using different variations of spelling depending on the dialect that's being used at the time. If that's true, right? If that one's true, then they think it's kind of the same. Or this Gubaru Gobrias could actually be a different individual than Ugabaru. And in this view, Darius may be a different name for Gubaru Gobrias, who was named as the principal governor of Babylon. And this view is distinct from Ugabaru because Ugabaru is actually a general who conquered. So we have, is the general who conquered, does he become the governor? That's view number 3, or excuse me, view number 2, or is view number 3 that they're different individuals? Ugabaru conquered it, and then this individual who is listed as Gubaru Gobrias in other texts is actually also called Darius the Mede in this context. I vote with number 3. Just, you know, I think it's the most reasonable based on the evidence I've seen. Although there is strong linguistic similarity, as you can even tell in the transliteration between Ugabaru and Gubaru, and that's what pushes scholars toward the second. I tend to think that they were different based on what I've read of the other inscriptions and just different people's commentary on them. Not worth debating here at this point. One popular explanation has been that Darius is Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. And he ruled Persia from around 530 to 522-ish, when right from the time he co-ruled for a little while. Cyrus was ill at the end of his life and then died. This one I don't buy, though it's been listed several times. I don't buy this one. I think that Cambyses would have been not available to rule at this time. And there's actually I can give you an old article in Bibliotheca Sacra, which is an old theological journal. It's been published by Dallas Seminary for decades now. But going back all the way to 1980, and a scholar named Yamauchi, who's a really good Bible scholar, kind of made a great case for why Bible-believing Christians should not accept the Cambyses theory, because it destroys Bible chronology if you do. So you'll hear all of those things. There you go. Bottom line is, what did I say? Who is Darius the Mede? He's exactly who God said he was in Daniel chapter 6. He's Darius the Mede, okay? That's who he was. What we do know is that the Medo-Persian Empire was utilizing leadership elements from both cultures as they ruled. Okay, so let's talk about how Persian law applied here. And I've already introduced it, so we'll just highlight a few things. First of all, note that the king was subject to law once it was confirmed in most cases. And he was unable to rescind it, which is the trouble that Darius gets himself into here. And we would say this is a decline in monarchical authority, right? We would also say that it's a step toward more just authority and more consistent authority, because when you have pure, absolute monarchical authority, you open human governance to a great deal of capriciousness, right? I decide today that all the Jews are friends, and I decide tomorrow that they are all enemies and we will destroy them. That's capricious, right? Before the Armenian genocide in the early 20th century by the Turkish Ottoman Empire's monarchy, the Armenians were actually considered within a group of non-majority, minority peoples that they called millets in the Ottoman Empire version, and they were considered the most loyal and the most helpful. There had actually been an Armenian Secretary of State to the Ottoman Empire. And within 10 years of that time period, the Ottomans decided the Armenians are the enemy, and 1 million of them were murdered by Ottoman Empire. The Armenian genocide continues to resound as a problematic diplomatic historic feature. The Turks, who are now modern Turkey, is a part of NATO. They really don't like it at all when Westerners bring up the Armenian genocide. They still like to deny it. But how quickly they could shift, right? The Armenians were the most favored minority, the most trusted minority. And then a genocide occurs. And it's within about 10 years. It's so fast. So the decline of monarchical authority actually can be looked at as an increase in more just governance. Even leaders are under the law. It's a fundamental principle of our government, right? Lex Rex, law is king. And even the king must be under the law, right? Even the ruler, even the president, even the Congress, everybody has to live under the law. It's a way of justice, right? This is seemingly an increase, but it is definitely a decrease from Nebuchadnezzar's absolute rule. And so if you recall, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream statue about the changing empires, the Medo-Persian Empire is represented by a less valuable material, silver, not gold, like the head. And this is God's version, not Nebuchadnezzar's version, right? This is the dream statue. And so generally, this is looked at as the fulfillment or the demonstration of how the rule is going to in some way decline in quality. Secondly, about the law is that the law requiring prayer only to the king seems to have come in this context from a belief that the king spoke for the gods. Now, again, the Medo-Persians did not have the deified monarchy view that some other peoples had, much like Nebuchadnezzar did not rule as a king, but as a god, but instead that they viewed the king as also having a kind of prophetic voice because they rule in the stead of the gods. Sometimes they could be viewed as kind of demigod people, but in this case, it was more that the king speaks for the gods. So that's probably why this appealed. And notice that it's only for a period of time. They would never have said, Darius would never have bought a new policy that the king is going to be the only person prayed to, because he still believes in the gods. And we don't want to offend the gods, right? But this is a statement, again, much like the statue that Nebuchadnezzar set up that everybody had to bow down to. This is appealing to the transition period of Darius as a kind of loyalty test. For 30 days, the only requests are going to be made to Darius. So we are acknowledging our sole dependence as Babylon, the former Chaldean Empire. We are now acknowledging our full dependence only on Darius, the new administration. So, of course, this also fed his ego, right? Oh, king, live forever. Let's only ask you for stuff. Okay. 30 days, right? Transition. Third thing. Why lions? I'm going to talk about the lions a little more here and get into it. But for right now, let's just look at the fact that it seems like, in the ancient world especially, using wild beasts to punish certain types of crime or wrongdoing seems to have been in other literature and contexts that it's talked about, seems to be a kind of expression about the uncivilized nature of the crime. Like, you're not submitting to civilization, and therefore you deserve to be thrown to beasts, and see how they'll deal with you. If you want to act like an uncivilized beast, we'll give you to the uncivilized beasts. And that seems to be the idea. So the punishment of being thrown into a den with wild beasts testified to what was trying to be expressed as a kind of lawlessness or uncivilized character of the condemned. But of course, the Lord overruled the sentence because of his clear and accurate command of justice. And since this seems to be the law of the Medes and Persians is the center of this whole account. The issue that God is a God who sees real justice, even when a kingdom or a government is trying to function by law, God knows the difference between human law and true justice. And because God overruled this, we see that he had a clear, accurate command, and also that he had the power to intervene. That God's people are never fully at the mercy of the law of mankind. God can always intervene when he wants to, because he's the just God. All right, so let's look at some ideas about Daniel in the lion's den. Paul Rubens, 1615. This looks to me a great deal more like 1600s and their romantic concept of things than it does like the 6th century BC. And so we get a lot of that, right? So you see the anguish of Daniel here. I don't know. It didn't sound, the account doesn't read that way. Unless it was deliberately purged of emotion, which it doesn't seem like Daniel does. When people are having emotional responses, remember, the hips go slack, the knees knock together. Daniel's not afraid to call it what it is, right? And Daniel doesn't strike me as the kind of arrogant man who would cover his own emotional response. I don't read anything in chapter 6 that looks quite like that. Also, this pit idea. In the archaeological finds around Babylon, there's nothing that looks like this. You don't have cave-like pits anywhere. So we don't find anything that seems like it would have been like that. So what is a den is the question.
Is there any indication in other texts what that word cast means? I wonder if that's where they're drawing it from. Cast
right, absolutely. Right, so it does. It means pretty much what it says. It's a straightforward term that means to be thrown to. Now, we often put cast with the word down. Cast down. And notice it never says that. It just says cast into. You can be cast aside, for example, exactly. You don't have to be cast down. So it doesn't have to be a hole. So other more modern representations, I think, probably have a better sense of this, okay? So the sentence also, I want to note, really importantly, the sentence that was given was not death specifically. It assumed death. Nobody comes out of a den of lions feeling good, right? It assumed death, but it never said that they had to die. Thus, the sentence could be carried out and Daniel could still survive, according to the law, the precision and care of God in his superintendence of things going on, right? But it was specifically to be thrown into the den. Thus, Darius could remove Daniel afterwards. These more realistic portrayals I think give you a sense that what we do have is accounts that the Medo-Persian Empire in particular, and probably the Neo-Babylonian Empire based on the decorations on the walls and things like that, the notion of capturing wild beasts and keeping them, we have evidence for that in Babylon with these kinds of more walled places. And I know it's on the slides, so that you don't have those slides right away, but you could jot it down. I was looking around to see if I could find something a little, something that would be helpful for people who wanted to explore this. And I found a really nice, clear, but brief discussion about the likelihood of containing lions in captivity in Babylon, and what kind of a den would have been present in the archaeology. And of all things, I found it at a Bible Church website. And I thought, well, that's interesting. This guy, because this is really good stuff. He must have been, he must be an unusually careful researcher of the scholarly literature and stuff. And then I realized, oh, that's because I know him. He's a guy that we went to college with, and his dad was an Old Testament Semitics professor at Grace Theological Seminary and at the Bible college that I went to. And it's like, oh, of course, he's an UD. That's why. And so, that makes perfect sense. So anyway, now he's pastoring, and he has a really nice piece there at Crossroads Bible Church website. So if you're interested, I can get that to you, but it's a really nice little short piece. Here's another perspective, and you see Daniel kind of looking up and out through maybe where it would have been a way to cast him in without throwing him down. It's obviously going down somewhat, right? Because the text says that when the others, the accusers and their families, they didn't get to the bottom before the animals got them. It's probably more like a ramp than a hole, is probably what's being described. My personal favorite that I found, and actually I think this one was, okay, I won't accuse myself, but I just want you to notice, so I will accuse myself a little bit. I want you to look real faintly right there. Yeah, I'm probably guilty. But anyway, cast in here, what was he doing? I like these for a couple of reasons. I like that there's calmness in Daniel. I think that speaks to what I see. I like this because what had Daniel constantly been doing that got him there? Yeah, so what's he going to do when he gets there? Da, 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 da. That's my personal favorite, okay? All right, last thing, and then we got to get out of here because we're out of time. The sentence was transferred to Daniel's accusers at the end, right? They and their families, their children, everybody's thrown in. Note that this is in contradiction to God's law. Deuteronomy 24:16 specifically forbids punishing the children and others for the crimes of the father, right? You don't do that. But they weren't following God's law. They were following the Medo-Persian law, and the wives and the children with the guilty were condemned. Also, just as a small testament, we don't know for sure, but notice that Daniel was not thrown in with his wives and children. What does that confirm that we assumed at the beginning? That eunuch really meant eunuch. Daniel was apparently not married and had kids. Otherwise, he, like them, would have been thrown in with family members, but he didn't have any. So this kind of gives us a hint that that's still true. We'll learn from the chapter next week. God's grace to you.